the alcohol still throbbed in my temples as I left Max's boisterous party. My phone read 10 to 3 in the morning, and tomorrow, or rather today, I had a crucial meeting with potential investors for my startup. I knew I looked rough. Crumpled shirt, tired eyes, the smell of cigarettes and beer clinging to my clothes. But something irresistible had kept me at that party until the very end, as if I was trying to outrun my own thoughts. The weight of responsibility that had been pressing down on me for months. For the past 6 months, my life had devolved into an endless cycle of meetings, presentations, and sleepless nights hunched over my laptop. The idea of creating an app for quickly finding ride shares seemed brilliant when I first jotted down the concept on a napkin at a cafe. Now 8 months into development, I felt like someone building a house of cards in a storm. Money was running out. The development team was starting to doubt the project's prospects, and I increasingly found myself wondering if I should have just stayed at my old job at the bank, where I had a stable paycheck and nothing was demanded of me beyond 8 hours of office presence. The October air was damp and unpleasantly sticky from the fine drizzle that had been falling all day. I pulled up the collar of my jacket and quickened my pace down the deserted street. Usually I'd take the bus home, but public transport wasn't running at this hour. And I didn't want to waste money on a cab. Every penny counted when you're living on the last of your savings and hoping for a miracle in the form of investments. The walk would take about 40 minutes, but I knew a way to cut it almost in half by going through the old part of the city, where Evergreen Cemetery was located. The thought of walking past a cemetery at this hour would normally have struck me as strange, to say the least. But the alcohol dulled my self-preservation instincts, and the fatigue and frustration from my own failures made me reckless. Besides, I wasn't a superstitious person. My technical degree and years in IT had taught me to think rationally and not believe in superstitions. The dead can't harm the living. It's just a fact based on a scientific understanding of the world. Everything else is just a figment of imagination and childhood fears. Evergreen Cemetery was one of the oldest in New Haven. Its history began in the 18th century when the city was much smaller, and this place was on the outskirts. Now the cemetery was practically in the center, surrounded by apartment buildings and small shops. A tall brick wall separated the world of the dead from the world of the living, but the gates were never locked. Too many people came here at all hours of the day and night to honor the departed or simply find peace and quiet amidst the city bustle. I'd passed by this place many times during the day, on my way to work or meetings, but I'd never actually gone inside. Something about the atmosphere of the old cemetery always caused a slight unease, which I attributed to a living person's natural reaction to symbols of death. Now, standing before the slightly ajar wrought iron gates at 2:30 in the morning, I felt a strange curiosity. Perhaps it was a way to test myself, to prove my own courage at a moment when everything else in my life felt uncertain and frightening. The path leading through the cemetery was well worn and wide. Many city dwellers used this route as a shortcut between two neighborhoods. Old lindens and maples growing among the graves formed a dense canopy, through which only occasionally did light from the streetlights on neighboring streets break through. I turned on my phone's flashlight and slowly moved along the winding path, trying not to pay attention to the dark silhouettes of monuments and crosses on either side. My breathing became deeper and more measured. Perhaps the fresh air was helping the alcohol dissipate, or maybe the unique atmosphere of this place made me focus. I thought about the upcoming meeting, replaying in my mind the arguments and figures that were supposed to convince investors of my project's potential. $200,000. That was the amount needed to complete development and launch the advertising campaign. It didn't sound like much in the grand scheme of the tech industry, but for me it was an astronomical sum. Suddenly I stopped. Somewhere ahead, around a bend in the path, there was a faint sound, something between a whisper and the rustle of autumn leaves. At first I thought it was the wind, but the air was completely still. The sound repeated, and this time it seemed to have a certain rhythm, almost like a conversation but too quiet to make out the words. I listened more carefully, holding my breath. My heart pounded, not from fear but rather from curiosity mixed with a slight unease. The rational part of my mind suggested it could be other people, perhaps a group of teenagers out for a late-night adventure in the cemetery, or homeless individuals who had found shelter here. But something about the nature of these sounds was so unusual that it made me doubt any logical explanations. I slowly moved forward, trying to step as quietly as possible. The sounds became clearer, and now I was almost certain I was hearing voices. Many voices speaking at once, but so quietly that the words blended into a single indistinct murmur. At times, I thought I could make out individual phrases, but when I tried to focus on them, they slipped away, as if dissolving into the general hum. Around the next bend in the path, I saw a faint, flickering glow. It came from somewhere deep within the cemetery to the left of the main path, and was so dim that at first I thought I was imagining it. But no. There was definitely a light source, soft and uneven like from candles or a kerosene lamp. The voices were coming from there. Curiosity got the better of caution. I turned off the path and began to make my way through the old graves in the direction of the light. The grass underfoot was wet from the rain, and I nearly slipped several times on the damp fallen leaves. The monuments became older and more elaborate. Wealthy citizens from the century before last were buried here, and their gravestones were true works of art. Marble angels with sorrowful faces, crosses with carved patterns, small chapels with wrought iron grates. As I approached the light source, I felt a strange change in the atmosphere. The air grew thicker, as if filled with an invisible mist, and the temperature dropped noticeably. My breath began to mist, though the night hadn't seemed particularly cold until then. The voices became increasingly distinct, and now I could catch individual words and phrases, though their meaning remained a mystery. They spoke of the past, of events that had happened long ago, of people who were no longer alive, of places that had changed beyond recognition or had disappeared entirely. There was a peculiar mournful melodiousness in their speech, like in lullabies or old ballads. Sometimes one of the speakers would mention dates, 1943, 1967, 1988, and I realized I was hearing the memories of people from different generations who had died at different times. Finally, I reached the source of the light. In a small clearing between old crypts, dozens of candles burned, placed directly on grave slabs and the sills of mausoleums. The candle flames flickered without wind, casting whimsical shadows on the marble faces of angels and the weathered inscriptions on the tombstones. But the most striking thing was that around these candles, on benches and directly on the grave slabs, people sat. Many people of different ages, from old folks to young men and women, from elegant ladies in early 20th century dresses to workers in greasy overalls. They all looked perfectly ordinary except for a strange paleness of skin and an unnatural stillness with which they sat. Their eyes were closed and their lips barely moved, uttering the very words I had heard on my approach. They were telling stories, each their own, but all at once creating this incredible chorus of memories. A woman in a black dress from the 30s spoke of dances in the city park and a beloved who went off to war. An elderly man in a World War II military uniform recalled comrades and the last battle at Stalingrad. A 10-year-old girl in a Soviet-era school uniform talked about her dreams of becoming a ballerina and how those dreams were cut short with her life during an epidemic. I stood there mesmerized, unable to move or utter a sound. My mind desperately searched for a rational explanation for what was happening. Perhaps it was some kind of theatrical production, an unusual performance, or a film shoot. But deep down, I knew that no actors could create such an atmosphere of authenticity, such depth of sadness and nostalgia that emanated from each of these people. Their stories intertwined with each other, creating an astonishing picture of the city's life over almost 2 centuries. I heard tales of the first automobiles and gaslighting, of revolutionary upheavals and peaceful years of construction, of wars and holidays, of love and loss. Suddenly, all the voices quieted at once, as if someone had turned off a radio. A dead silence enveloped the cemetery, and in that silence, I heard my own heavy breathing and pounding heartbeat. Slowly, one by one, these people began to open their eyes and turn their heads towards me. Their gazes were not hostile, but rather surprised and interested. There was something akin to joy in their eyes, the joy of meeting a living person who could see and hear them. The woman in the black dress was the first to speak. Her voice was quiet but surprisingly clear in the night silence. She said that for many years no living person had entered their circle, that most people passed by without noticing or hearing them. She explained that they gathered here every night to share memories and support each other in this strange existence between life and death. Their stories were all they had left, the only way to maintain some connection with the world they had left behind. The old soldier added that time flowed differently for them. They remembered every day of their lives with incredible clarity, but the days after death merged into a single stream where there was no past or future, only an endless present. He explained that living people usually didn't see them because they existed in a different dimension of time and perception. But sometimes, very rarely, a person could cross that invisible boundary. The schoolgirl came closer and asked if I had been feeling strange lately. Had I noticed that people sometimes looked through me as if they didn't see me or didn't answer my questions? Her words made me think. Indeed, in recent weeks, I had encountered several inexplicable situations. The cashier at the store didn't notice me for a long time, although I was standing right in front of her. My neighbor on the landing walked past without returning my greeting, although we always said hello. Colleagues at work sometimes spoke as if I wasn't in the room, even though I was sitting right there and participating in the discussion. But I attributed all these episodes to people's fatigue, their immersion in their own problems, to the hustle and bustle of modern life that makes us inattentive to each other. Now, listening to this girl's words, I felt the first stirrings of anxiety. What if there really was something wrong with my perception? What if illness or stress was affecting my ability to interact normally with the surrounding world? A young man in a 1950s suit told his story. He worked as an engineer at a factory and dreamed of inventing something important that would change people's lives for the better. His project for a new type of engine was almost ready when an accident occurred at the factory. He died without ever realizing his dream. Now he watched the world develop without him, as other people created the inventions he had dreamed of. There was so much bitterness and regret in his story that my heart ached. I thought about my own project, about months of work on the app, about the hopes and fears associated with the upcoming meeting with investors. Was I also destined to be left with unrealized plans? Would all my efforts be in vain, like the efforts of this young engineer? The thought was so painful that I tried to push it away, focusing on the words of the other storytellers. An elderly woman in a simple pre-war dress told about her children, whom she raised alone after her husband's death. She worked as a seamstress, took orders at home, and economized on everything to give her children an education. She died of tuberculosis at 45, seeing her eldest son enter university but not living to see him graduate. Now she sometimes visited the cemetery where her children were buried, already grown old and died of old age. Time for her had stopped at the moment when she was a young mother, full of hopes and plans. These stories captivated me. Each was unique, yet all were part of one larger story. The story of people who lived, loved, dreamed, and suffered in this city for many generations. I felt like a witness to something incredible, a keeper of secrets that no living person was meant to know. Strangely, their presence calmed me. Among these people who had faced death and retained their memories, my problems seemed less significant. As the first signs of dawn began to appear on the horizon, the dead slowly began to disappear. First, their outlines became less distinct, then they turned into translucent silhouettes, and then dissolved into the morning air as if they had never been there at all. The candles extinguished themselves, leaving behind only a faint scent of wax and something else, an aroma I couldn't identify, but which reminded me of old books and dried flowers. I was left alone among the graves, feeling drained and bewildered. Had it all been a dream? Had alcohol and fatigue played such a cruel trick on me? But the sensations were too vivid and real to be a figment of imagination. I remembered every word, every face, every intonation of the voices. Moreover, I felt that something had changed within me. It was as if that invisible boundary between the worlds of the living and the dead had become more permeable for me. The walk home passed in a blur. I mechanically walked along the familiar streets, but my thoughts were occupied by the encounter in the cemetery. At home, I showered, brewed coffee, and tried to focus on preparing for the presentation, but concentration was difficult. The words of the investment plan blurred before my eyes, and in my head the voices of the dead echoed, telling their stories. The meeting with potential investors was a failure. I couldn't focus on the numbers and forecasts, constantly got distracted, and several times lost my train of thought. The investors politely listened to the presentation, asked a few perfunctory questions, and said they would contact me within a week. I knew what that meant: rejection. My last chance to get funding had slipped away. All day I felt broken and depressed. Working on the project seemed meaningless, the future uncertain, and life directionless. By evening, the depression became so strong that I decided to take a walk, hoping that fresh air would help me clear my head. Without realizing it, I headed towards the old part of the city, towards Evergreen Cemetery. As I approached the familiar gates, I felt a strange excitement. What if last night hadn't been a dream after all? What if these people, the dead, really gathered here every night? The desire to see them again was so strong that it drowned out all reasonable objections. I needed their stories, their presence, the comfort they gave me. When I reached the familiar clearing, the candles were already burning, and the dead sat in their places, telling their endless stories. They greeted me like an old friend, as if they knew I would definitely return. That night, I heard new stories. About an artist who never painted his masterpiece. About a young mother who died of puerperal fever. About an old teacher who dedicated his life to educating children and died in oblivion. With each story, I felt an increasing connection to these people. Their fates resonated with my own experiences. Their unrealized dreams reflected my fears and doubts. I began to tell them about myself, about my project, about the failed meeting with investors, about the feeling of hopelessness that had enveloped me. They listened carefully and with understanding, offered advice and support, and shared their experiences of life's failures and triumphs. The following weeks passed in a strange rhythm. Days were spent trying to return to a normal life, searching for a new job, meeting potential partners, attempting to find alternative funding sources for my project. But all these efforts seemed meaningless and empty. People in offices spoke to me formally and distantly, as if performing an unpleasant duty. HR managers skimmed my resume inattentively, asked standard questions, and promised to call back. No one called back. Business partners canceled meetings at the last minute or postponed them indefinitely. Gradually, I began to notice that those around me were behaving more and more strangely. In cafes, waiters took forever to approach my table, even though I was sitting in a visible spot and tried several times to get their attention. At the bank, employees at the information desk looked straight through me as if I were invisible. Even my few friends started answering calls reluctantly, spoke distractedly, and quickly ended conversations with various excuses. The only place where I felt needed and understood was the cemetery at night. Every evening, as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon, I was irresistibly drawn there. I learned to find my way to the cherished clearing even in complete darkness. My feet carried me along the familiar paths between the graves. The dead always waited for me, their candles lighting themselves, creating a cozy circle of light amidst the surrounding darkness. With each passing night, their stories became more personal and candid. The woman in the black dress told me about her secret love for a married man that tormented her throughout her life. The old soldier recounted how he accidentally shot his comrade in the dark and suffered from guilt for the rest of his life. The schoolgirl confessed that she hadn't died of an illness as I initially thought, but had taken her own life, unable to bear the bullying of her classmates. Their revelations were painful, yet at the same time liberating. They shared with me what they could never have told when alive. I, too, began to open up to them. I talked about my childhood fears, my difficult relationship with parents who didn't understand my ambitions, and the feeling of loneliness that had haunted me since adolescence. I spoke of the women I loved but couldn't keep, of friends who gradually drifted away when I became too absorbed in work. The dead listened without judgment, their eyes glowing with understanding and empathy. The young engineer with whom I had become particularly close explained that death wasn't the end, but a transition to another state of existence. He said that many people died without even realizing it, especially if death was sudden or occurred in their sleep. They continued to live their usual lives, not understanding why those around them began to treat them differently. Only when the connection with the world of the living became very weak did they begin to grasp the truth. His words made me think deeply. I tried to recall when exactly this strange alienation from others began. It seemed the first signs appeared about a month ago, shortly after that late-night party at Max's. But the more I pondered, the more hazy my memories of that time became. I remembered walking home through the cemetery. I remembered meeting the dead, but the events of the preceding days and weeks blurred as if viewed in a half-sleep. The elderly seamstress once asked me if I remembered my last meal, my last conversation with a living person, the last time I looked in a mirror. Her question startled me. I genuinely couldn't recall anything of the sort. When did I last eat? Strangely, I hadn't felt hungry in weeks. When was the last time I truly spoke to a living person, not just exchanging formal phrases? And mirrors. I had avoided mirrors lately, though I didn't understand why. These thoughts disturbed me, but I pushed them away. The dead had become my family, my only true friends. Among them, I felt alive, needed, understood. Their stories filled my existence with meaning, gave me a sense of belonging to something greater than my own failed life. A middle-aged artist who died in the early 20th century taught me to see beauty in the world around me in a new way. He spoke of how light fell on marble gravestones, how tree shadows created amazing patterns on grave slabs, how even in death there was its own aesthetic. Under his influence, I began to notice details that had previously escaped my attention. The elegance of antique carving on crypts, the nobility of time-darkened bronze, the poetry of weathered inscriptions in Old Church Slavonic. A young mother who died in childbirth shared with me the maternal love she never got to give her child. She spoke of dreams in which she saw her daughter grow up, go to school, get married, have her own children. These dreams were so vivid that they seemed like memories of real events. Through her, I understood what unconditional love, demanding nothing in return, could be. The old teacher imparted wisdom to me, accumulated over long years of working with people. He spoke of how every person carries a unique story within them, worthy of being heard and understood. Death doesn't erase this story. It merely transfers it to another dimension where it can exist forever, immune to oblivion and the distortions of time. Days began to blend into a single stream. I stopped keeping track of time, didn't answer phone calls, ignored emails. My project completely stalled. My apartment lease expired, but it didn't bother me. I lived from night to night, from meeting to meeting with my dead friends. Their world became more real to me than the world of the living. One night, a new person joined our circle, a young man about my age in modern clothes. He looked bewildered and frightened, constantly looking around as if he couldn't believe what was happening. The other dead surrounded him with care, explaining the situation gently and patiently. It turned out he had died in a car accident a few days ago, but only now was he beginning to realize his state. Watching him, I remembered myself on my first night in the cemetery. The same bewilderment, the same shock of encountering the impossible. But now I was one of them, a full member of this strange community. I helped the newcomer settle in, told him about the rules of existence in the world of the dead, and shared my experience of adapting to the new state. The woman in the black dress noted that I had changed during our acquaintance. She said that in the first nights I still retained some features of a living person. Brighter skin tones, clearer body contours, more lively eyes. Now I had become like the other dead, pale, slightly blurred, with eyes in which only a flicker of memories burned. Her words didn't frighten me. On the contrary, I felt relief at finally finding my place in the world. Among the living, I always felt like an outsider, not fitting into their rhythm of life, their values, their aspirations. Here, among the dead, I belonged. We understood each other without words, shared a common sadness for lost opportunities and a common joy in the ability to share our stories. The old soldier told me how the process of full transition into the world of the dead occurred. He said that at first a person loses the ability to influence the physical world. They can no longer move objects, open doors, or leave traces. Then living people stop seeing and hearing them, although they can still observe their lives. And finally, there comes a moment when the connection with the world of the living is completely severed, and the soul passes into a special state where time flows differently and memories become more real than the outside world. I realized I was in the final stage of this process. The world of the living became increasingly ghostly and distant for me. Their problems and concerns seemed petty and unimportant. Their hustle and bustle appeared meaningless against the backdrop of eternity in which the dead existed. I no longer envied them, no longer sought to return to their world. The cemetery had become my home, and these amazing people who preserved their souls after the death of their bodies were my family. The schoolgirl, who had become especially close to me, explained that not all the deceased were able to join their circle. Many souls immediately after death moved further into unknown dimensions. But some, those who had a strong emotional connection to the earthly world, unfinished business, or deep regrets, remained here. They gathered in old cemeteries in places steeped in the memory of the past and created their communities. She said that my presence among them was no accident. My soul had been ready for this transition even during my lifetime. Disappointment in the world of the living, a feeling of alienation, the inability to find my place among people. All this prepared me for a new existence. Death became for me not an end, but a liberation from the burden of an imperfect life. The young engineer added that some people died spiritually long before physical death. They continued to walk, talk, perform habitual actions, but their souls were already ready for the transition. Such people found their way to the communities of the dead more easily than others and adapted more quickly to the new state. His words deeply resonated within me. I recalled the last months of my life, constant fatigue, apathy, the feeling that I was simply drifting, not controlling my destiny. Perhaps my soul really began to die even when my body was alive and healthy. Perhaps that night in the cemetery wasn't a chance encounter with the mystical, but a natural outcome of a long process of spiritual fading. The artist told me about his observations of the living world for over a century. He had seen how the city changed, how generations of people were born and died, how technology and art developed. From the height of his posthumous existence, he understood the cyclical nature of human passions, the repeatability of life's dramas, and the illusory nature of many human aspirations. He said that living people took their problems too seriously, not understanding their temporality. They worried about money, careers, public recognition, not realizing that all this would disappear with their physical existence. The true value lay only in relationships between people, emotions, experiences, memories, what could be preserved in the soul even after death. Listening to him, I thought about my failed career, about the project on which I had spent so much effort and time. Now all of it seemed like a childish game of importance. What did investments and business plans matter compared to the eternal truths that were being revealed to me in communication with the dead? Their wisdom was deeper than any management textbooks, their experience more valuable than the most expensive MBA programs. The elderly seamstress shared with me her reflections on the nature of time. She explained that for the dead, past, present, and future existed simultaneously. They could recall events from their childhood with the same clarity as they could foresee what would happen to their descendants decades later. Death freed the soul from linear perception of time, allowing it to see life as a holistic picture, where every event was connected to others by invisible threads of fate. Her words made me ponder my own perception of time. Indeed, the past weeks or months, I couldn't say exactly how long it had been, had flowed in a peculiar way. Days blurred into a single stream, the boundaries between sleep and wakefulness indistinct. Sometimes I felt like I was reliving the same events multiple times, and other times I felt as though I was missing entire chunks of time, as if falling into oblivion. One night, as our usual circle gathered in our customary spot among the graves, another soul joined us, an elderly man in a 1990s suit. He seemed like a fresh corpse, if I could put it that way, still retaining some features of a recently deceased person. His story was simple and sad. A heart attack at work at 57, no one around to help, dying alone amidst office documents and unfinished projects. As he told his story, he mentioned the date of his death. I asked him to repeat it, thinking I'd misheard. But no, he had died just 3 days ago in October 2024. This information hit me like a lightning bolt. If he died 3 days ago and I'd been meeting with the dead for several months, then it meant... I tried to recall exactly when that first night in the cemetery had been, but the memories blurred, like trying to grasp water with my hands. The woman in the black dress noticed my confusion and gently asked if I wanted to know the truth about myself. She said that the moment had come when I was ready to hear the full story of my transition into the world of the dead. Until then, they had spared me, allowing me to gradually adjust to the new state, but now it was time for final realization. The old soldier took on the role of narrator. His voice was calm and sorrowful, like a doctor delivering an incurable diagnosis. He told me that I had indeed died that night when I first came to the cemetery. It hadn't happened at the cemetery, but earlier at Max's party, which I remembered as the last vivid event of my life. According to him, I hadn't just drunk a lot at that party. I had taken a drug that someone had slipped into my drink. Perhaps it was a cruel joke or a mistake, but the result was tragic. The mixture of alcohol and the narcotic substance caused my heart to stop. I died quickly and relatively painlessly, not even realizing what was happening. My body was found only in the morning when the other guests began to wake up after the party, but my soul didn't immediately grasp what had happened. As often happens with sudden death, especially under the influence of alcohol, I continued to believe I was alive. Familiar routes, familiar places, the repetition of everyday rituals. All of this created the illusion of continued existence. Only gradually did it dawn on me that something was wrong. People didn't notice me, didn't respond to my words, looked through me. The schoolgirl added that the cemetery attracted souls ready to acknowledge their new state. She said that on that first night I hadn't come here by chance. Subconsciously, I already knew the truth about myself, but my conscious mind refused to accept it. Meeting the community of the dead became a way for me to gradually adapt to reality. The young engineer explained that all those weeks when I thought I was living a normal life were merely echoes of my memories. Meetings with investors, job searches, attempts to revive the project. All of this was happening only in my mind, which was trying to complete unfinished business to find meaning in a life cut short. In reality, my body had long since rested in the city cemetery, and my soul had been flitting between the world of the living and the world of the dead, finding no peace. This truth crashed down on me with such force that I felt reality around me begin to crack. Memories that had seemed absolutely reliable suddenly appeared in a new light. I understood why people looked at me so strangely, why they didn't answer my questions, why all my attempts to return to a normal life failed. The living couldn't see me because I was no longer among them. The artist told me about his observations of my state from the first night. He saw how I gradually lost connection with the physical world, how my astral body became less dense and my consciousness more ethereal. The process of full transition into the world of the dead took me longer than most others because I desperately clung to the illusion of life, unwilling to acknowledge my new state. The elderly seamstress said that now that I finally knew the truth, two paths opened before me. The first was to join their community permanently, to embrace the role of a keeper of memories and a storyteller for other souls who found their way to the cemetery. The second was to let go of all earthly attachments and move on, into unknown dimensions where souls found ultimate peace. I pondered her words for a long time. The idea of remaining among the dead who had become closer than family seemed appealing. Here I was understood, here I was needed, here my story mattered. But at the same time, I felt that clinging to the past, even such a comfortable past as communicating with these amazing souls, might be another form of escape from reality. The woman in the black dress noticed my hesitation and told her full story. It turned out she had died more than 80 years ago, but still couldn't let go of the memories of her earthly life. Her beloved for whom she lived had long since died and moved on. But she continued to wait for him here in the cemetery, hoping for reunification. This hope had become a curse for her, preventing her from finding peace. The old soldier added that each of them was tied to this place by some unresolved issues or unfulfilled emotions. He himself couldn't forget the war, the comrades he couldn't save, the guilt of surviving when others perished. These experiences kept his soul in the earthly dimension, preventing him from moving forward. The schoolgirl confessed that what held her here was not only the trauma of suicide, but also the desire to prevent similar tragedies. She hoped that someday she could help another desperate child, save them from a fatal mistake. But so far, she hadn't succeeded. Living children couldn't see or hear her. Listening to their stories, I understood that each of my new dead friends was trapped by their own attachments and regrets. They had created an illusion of meaningful existence for themselves, but in reality they were merely treading water, unable to move forward. And now they were offering me to join their eternal waiting, their endless replaying of the past. The young engineer, as if reading my thoughts, said that some souls did find the strength to move on. He had seen how, over the years of his posthumous existence, many of their comrades gradually released their earthly attachments and dissolved into the light coming from unknown dimensions. This light didn't appear often, but when it did, the soul ready for transition simply disappeared, and the others knew it had found ultimate peace. He said that he himself had seen this light several times and felt its attractive force. But each time, something held him back. Unfinished inventions, unrealized ideas, a desire to see how science and technology developed. Now, after many decades of observation, he understood that all his earthly fascinations were just a way to avoid the final transition into the unknown. The artist added that creativity was an especially strong attachment that could hold a soul in the earthly dimension for centuries. He himself couldn't let go of his unfulfilled concepts, unfinished paintings, unembodied images. Every night he mentally painted, creating works that no one would ever see. This creativity was both a source of joy and a curse, preventing him from finding peace. The elderly seamstress told of her dreams in which she saw the adult children she had never been able to raise. These dreams were so vivid and real that she preferred them to the reality of her posthumous existence. But gradually she began to understand that these visions were merely products of her own consciousness, an attempt to compensate for what had been lost with death. Listening to all these stories, I felt a growing understanding of the true nature of my situation. I had died young, without having realized many plans, without finding love, without starting a family, without leaving anything significant behind. My startup, on which I had worked with such passion, turned out to be another illusion of success in a world full of such illusions. But clinging to these unfulfilled dreams would mean repeating the mistake of my new friends, getting stuck in the past, unable to move forward. At the same time, the thought of complete disappearance, of dissolving into the unknown, frightened me. What was beyond this intermediate existence? Was there something after final death, or was it just nothingness? The dead I communicated with didn't know the answer to this question themselves. Those who had gone into the light never returned to tell of their experience. The woman in the black dress noticed my doubts and said that the choice should not be made out of fear, but from an understanding of what was truly important for the soul. She confessed that she herself had many times been close to deciding to let go of the past, but each time the fear of the unknown made her stay. Now, watching my struggles, she began to understand that this fear was just another illusion, trapping souls in an intermediate existence. The old soldier spoke of how the war changed his perception of life and death. He saw people die instantly without fear or regret, simply moving from one state to another. Death seemed to him a natural part of life, no more terrifying than sleep after a hard day. But when he himself died, it turned out that accepting this transition was much harder than observing it from the outside. The schoolgirl said that children usually accepted death more easily than adults, because they had fewer attachments and regrets. But her case was special. Suicide created additional trauma that complicated the transition process. She confessed that she often envied those souls who died a natural death in old age, having lived a full life. The young engineer shared his observations of changes in the world of the living. Over decades of his posthumous existence, he saw how technologies he had dreamed of in life developed. Many of his ideas were realized by other people, evolved and improved. This understanding helped him realize that the death of one person did not stop the progress of humanity. Ideas lived their own lives, passing from one consciousness to another. The artist added that art also lived independently of its creators. Many great works were created by people who did not live to see their talent recognized. But the beauty they created continued to exist and inspire new generations. Perhaps, he thought, true immortality lay not in the preservation of one's personality after death, but in the influence each person had on the world through their actions and creativity. These reflections made me look at my own life and death in a new light. Yes, I died young, without having accomplished many plans. But even in my short existence, I managed to touch the lives of others, share ideas, create something new. My startup, on which I had worked with such passion, turned out to be another illusion of success in a world full of such illusions. But clinging to these unfulfilled dreams would mean repeating the mistake of my new friends, getting stuck in the past, unable to move forward. At the same time, the thought of complete disappearance, of dissolving into the unknown, frightened me. What lay beyond this intermediate existence? Was there something after final death, or was it simply nothingness? The dead I spoke with did not know the answer to this question themselves. Those who had gone into the light never returned to tell of their experience. The woman in the black dress noticed my doubts and said that the choice should be made not from fear, but from an understanding of what was truly important for the soul. She confessed that she herself had been close to deciding to let go of the past many times, but each time the fear of the unknown made her stay. Now, observing my torment, she began to understand that this fear was just another illusion, trapping souls in an intermediate existence. The old soldier told about how the war changed his understanding of life and death. He saw people die instantly without fear or regret, simply transitioning from one state to another. Death seemed to him a natural part of life, no more terrifying than sleep after a hard day. But when he himself died, it turned out that accepting this transition was much more difficult than observing it from afar. The schoolgirl said that children usually accepted death more easily than adults because they had fewer attachments and regrets. But her case was special. Suicide created additional trauma that complicated the transition process. She admitted that she often envied those souls who died a natural death in old age, having lived a full life. The young engineer shared his observations of changes in the world of the living. Over decades of his posthumous existence, he saw how technologies he had dreamed of in life developed. Many of his ideas were embodied by other people, evolved and improved. This understanding helped him realize that the death of one person does not stop the progress of humanity. Ideas live their own lives, passing from one consciousness to another. The artist added that art also lived independently of its creators. Many great works were created by people who did not live to see their talent recognized. But the beauty they created continues to exist and inspire new generations. Perhaps, he thought, true immortality lay not in the preservation of one's personality after death, but in the influence each person had on the world through their actions and creativity. These reflections made me look at my own life and death in a new light. Yes, I died young, without having accomplished many plans. But even in my short existence, I managed to touch the lives of others, share ideas, create something new. My startup might not have received funding, but the ideas that formed its basis might find embodiment in the work of other developers. The connections I forged with people, the emotions I experienced and gave to others would not disappear without a trace. Gradually, I began to understand that clinging to unfinished business and unrealized plans was a manifestation of selfishness, an unwillingness to accept the natural course of things. Every person comes into the world for a certain time, plays their role in the grand drama of humanity, and then yields their place to new generations. Trying to prolong this existence in the form of a ghost or spirit meant violating the natural order. One of the last nights I spent in the circle of the dead, I told them about my decision. I said that I was ready to let go of the past and accept what awaited me beyond this intermediate existence. I no longer wanted to cling to the illusions of an unlived life or create new attachments in the world of the dead. My friends listened to me with understanding and sadness. The woman in the black dress confessed that my example helped her too to think about the need to move on. The old soldier said that the war, which had held him captive in memories for so long, was finally beginning to release his soul. The schoolgirl decided it was time to forgive herself for her fatal mistake and not spend eternity trying to correct the past. The artist declared that he was ready to release his unfinished works and trust that beauty would find a way to exist in the world without his involvement. The young engineer said that scientific progress had its own path, and his personal participation was no longer needed. The elderly seamstress decided that the maternal love she couldn't give her children could be passed into the world in another form, through compassion for all living beings. It was astonishing to see how my decision triggered a chain reaction of liberation among souls who had been chained to the cemetery for decades by their fears and regrets. We spent one last night together, sharing not memories of the past, but hopes for what lay ahead. When the dawn began, not the usual dawn we observed every morning, but a special one filled with an unusual golden light, we all felt its attractive force. This light did not come from the sun, but from some other source, deeper and more powerful. There was nothing frightening about it, only peace, understanding, and the promise of ultimate liberation from all earthly suffering. One by one, we rose from our places among the graves and moved towards the light. I looked back at the cemetery one last time, at the old crypts, the marble angels, the weathered gravestones, witnesses to so many human dramas. This place had given me the opportunity to understand the truth about myself and find the path to liberation. Now I was ready to move on. The light grew brighter, but it didn't blind my eyes. On the contrary, it filled my soul with clarity and understanding. I felt the last attachments to the earthly world disappear, the last regrets about a life unlived. My story ended tragically, a young death from accidental poisoning at a party. But now I understood that the tragedy was not in death itself, but in the unwillingness to accept it as a natural part of existence. In the final moment, as the light completely enveloped me, I felt an incredible sense of freedom and peace. All the questions that had tormented me in life and after death lost their meaning. I finally let go of the illusion of my own importance and dissolved into something infinitely greater than my individual story. Thus ended my journey through the intermediate world between life and death. The story I had been telling myself all these months was the final attempt of consciousness to find meaning in a senseless tragedy. But the true meaning was not in avoiding death or finding a way to prolong existence, but in accepting finality as the condition that makes every moment of life precious and unique. My voice fades, the story draws to a close. I am no longer a young man walking home from a party through an old cemetery. I am not a ghost, suspended between worlds. I have become part of that light which frees souls from their earthly attachments and leads them to ultimate peace. And if another lost soul ever finds its way to the cemetery, I will be among those who help it understand the truth and find the path to liberation.